All right, welcome back. This is going to be the second half of Lecture 5, which is based on Chapter 8 from the book. We basically are going to pick it up at why did the Middle East choose statism. I mostly covered in the back end of the last lecture, but I want to sort of get you up to date. All right, so first, they lag behind in industrialization. We talked about that. They thought that state funding and sort of financial support from the state to corporations or businesses or industry or whatever was going to be the best approach, right? Number two, nationalist leaders in this region especially saw both communism and free market capitalism with suspicion, right? Because not only has the West sort of put pressure on them, but so has the USSR, and now, contemporarily Russia, in places like Iran, Syria, elsewhere, right? Egypt, lots of different spots. And so this was sort of a middling approach, right? The state didn't own all enterprises by any means, right? There was still some free market capitalism going on, but they were trying to develop particularly chosen industries. Okay. Like we covered before, too, we had an ISI approach, import substitution rather than export oriented. This meant high levels of protectionism, trade barriers, tariffs, and chosen development of particular industries. And they just never became internationally competitive, right? Like Brazil tried to build out its own like auto industry, right? Has anyone ever seen a Brazilian car outside of Brazil? Not very many, right? And they just were never able to really compete. All right, I wanted to add one. The fourth I say is political goals, right? Statism furthered political goals through the sort of rentier or extractive economy. It allows higher levels of graft, grift, bribes, corruption, etc. It allows for enormous state employment, which can help to control the population and their willingness to speak out against the state. But it has also sort of disincentivized things like innovation, human capital, economic sectoral diversification, etc. All right. And so if you look at slide, I guess this is 3 or 4, the one with state-owned enterprises, right? You can see that generally Latin America has left this behind in its history, right? Europe still has high levels of sort of state involvement in state-owned enterprises. There was this sort of Reagan and Thatcher movement to try and, neoliberalize some of these states, but not all of them went in that direction. East Asia and Southeast Asia, as we know, tend to have really high state level development. Even in places like Japan and South Korea, which sort of move toward the export oriented approach, there's still some high levels of these, like with South Korean, I think it's called chaebols, these sort of conglomerate groups that have far more access than others, etc. But you could also see the Middle East has a pretty high level, especially for such a small population and such a small number of countries in this area. They have pretty high levels to this day of state-owned enterprises. Okay, the next map is going to be on slide 4 or 5, depending on how you're counting. So I wanted to provide some of my own thoughts on sort of state employment, right? This increases, I think, of much in life through economic game theory lenses. And so, in a sense, when the state is providing you employment, and often this is sort of employment in name only, like you're not really trained to do anything, you're pretty much just collecting a check from the state. But it increases the cost drastically of questioning your state, right? And so this can become problematic and can lead to some of that problem with, human rights repression and oppression. but also the dictator's dilemma, where you're not getting good information about how happy your citizens are. And so sometimes this is why you get massive pop ups like the Arab Spring, where the kid sat down in a market and lit himself on fire to protest the state. And the Middle East and Maghreb areas just exploded with riots and assassinations and all kinds of stuff. It also allows you, this statist state employment approach allows you to pack the bureaucracy with loyalists, right? And so we're not only seeing this in the Middle East now, but also in a lot of the sort of the authoritarian or competitive authoritarian states on the scene, and many of the ones that are trying to move forward with sort of far right nationalist projects, right? So Viktor Orban, who just got ousted, I mean, arguably Donald Trump, these sorts of things where you just pack the bureaucracy with loyalists and it gives you more control over the state and the citizen population. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so I think Saudi Arabia is a good sort of indicator of this, right? And you'll also notice that you can't really find data on a lot of these countries, especially the ones that sort of don't want you to know what this looks like, right? But also the states where it's dangerous to maybe collect data, that sort of stuff. But Saudi Arabia provides a pretty good example. They have very high levels of state employment. But, from internal reports and journalism and stuff, nobody really does a whole lot, right? They're not well educated or prepared or trained unless you're sort of in the upper echelon. It's just a state provided income for you to sort of just live your life and look the other way when it comes to corruption and political rights and things like this, right? Okay, let's see. We will move on. All right, so this is a nice resource extraction map, and it shows you what is the percentage of your sort of GDP or GNP. I'm not sure how they measured this. I had to kind of clip the map a little bit because it's really huge. But the link's there if you want to go look at it. And so you can see that there are high levels of resource extraction all the way up from basically southern Africa all the way eastward up into Russia, right? Where lots of minerals, critical minerals, gemstones, gold, oil, etc., are located. And you can see the percentage of each state's economy that is driven by this sort of extractive or rentier economic systems, right? And so Libya is the highest. That's sort of what kept Muammar Gaddafi in power for so long. But you can see sort of the Middle East is dominated by this stuff. Oman, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq are all these sort of rentier extractive economies, right? And just looking at the map, you can also see the states with the highest levels of this, the greener states on the map. Also, there tends to be a trend toward worse management, worse political rights, worse economic outcomes, lots of this stuff, right? And you'll notice this trend as we move forward on these maps. All right, the next one, either slide 6 or 7. This is GDP per capita. It's really nice to not only see sort of a comparison across the entire planet, right? Um, but you can also see massive differentiation inside of the Middle East region, right? Where Yemen, who is in deep civil war and has been for most of the last couple generations, has a $465 average citizen income, right? And this is all sort of placed toward the US dollar, right? So they make 465 US dollars per year in Yemen for the average citizen, all the way up to Qatar, which tends to be seen as, one of the rising, richest average citizen states on the planet, and others like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have done really well, largely due to petroleum. But they are also quickly learning in the past, I don't know, 15 years or so to diversify not necessarily their economy, right, and different sectors, but to diversify their assets, right? And so you see states like Qatar and UAE and Saudi Arabia getting more involved in buying portions of sports teams and, you know, um, video game companies. And I mean, shit, they threw like $2 billion at Trump's kid or kid in law, I guess, Kushner. um, there's been a lot, and they buy a crap load of weapons from the United States. Many of these countries in the region do. But you can see just there's vast, vast differences between, the average state, which is probably making around $5,000 or $6,000, and then sort of the big ones, or the economically powerful ones like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc. All right. Excuse me. Oh man, this next one's huge. What did I do? Oh, I zoomed in. Okay. So why did they get generally stagnant economies? One, they had giant bloated budgets from trying to not only sort of provide fake jobs for their citizens in many senses, but also the statist capitalism, right? Which when you try to build a chosen industry and an autarkic domestic market, it leads generally to really piss poor efficiency, terrible management, corruption, no reinvestment in new technology or manufacturing facilities or human capital and training. And so eventually the state is not only propping up their industries by dumping money into industries that could never compete in the real market, but also they're having to prop up their citizens by sending them money because they're all unemployed, and there's hunger, rifling through the sector. And, this is just a really, really bad approach from what we know. And it caused severe and crippling debt in some senses. We also get rising prices, right? And this is all sort of tied together economically. As you get sort of higher corruption and graft and worse management, because you're not having to compete in a real market, you get declining training, you get reductions in research and development, you get far reduced reinvestment in technologies and stuff like I talked about. You start to see rising unemployment, and this goes along with rising populations in many of these countries. You get more subsidies to both the unemployed citizens and the declining state corporations. Eventually, the IMF basically stepped in and said, "Okay, well, we're going to be willing to give you some capital to borrow further, but what we want from you is forced neoliberalism and hard austerity." The IMF calls it austerity, but really it's a reduction in social welfare programs. And so this goes over really hard in some countries, right? And while it is a tough pill to swallow, and many times this has absolutely not worked and has been sort of seen as manipulative and exploitative by the IMF and the World Bank, I would also point out, though, that the states that did do this and really put in an effort, like Morocco and Tunisia and Turkey, all tended to do better than their peers, especially when you pull out the non-petrol rentier states, right? And so, yeah, Tunisia, Morocco, Turkey, like they're not world beaters by any means, but they tend to have a little bit happier citizens. They tend to have more diversified economies. They tend to have, at least in modern times, a little less political repression. And so, they've done all right compared to some of the ones who weren't willing to either swallow the austerity pill or who rely um, on oil and that sort of stuff. Okay, I'm gonna leave that there. The final section is on rantierism and rentier states. So I'm gonna pick it up in the next section. All right, thanks for being here.